In 2005, I moved from New York City to Seville, Spain, thinking that I would stick around here for 1 or 2 years until I learned the language, then I would return. It turned out that I met the woman who would become my wife a year later. We had children very, very quickly. And it looks like I'm going to be here until I go to my grave. I have no real reasons to return home. I remember when my first son was born in 2008. I had been here for about 3 years. My Spanish was, well, decent. But my son was born and the doctors took him out of my wife's arms basically and put him in an incubator for reasons that I didn't understand, because I couldn't understand the doctors when they explained it to me. And in that moment, it dawned on me that I absolutely had to become not just fluent in Spanish, but deft in it. And so I made the decision to stop reading and writing in English and to do it only in Spanish. It was fateful because one day I decided to send some of my reflections to the local newspaper, and they agreed to publish them in Diario de Sevilla, which is the newspaper of record here. And then that sort of developed into a memoir, which was published by a small independent press in Almeria, which is one of the provinces of Andalusia, a publishing house called Confluencias, Editorial Confluencias. So my first book was published in my second language. Anyway, one of my favorite writers in English, an American or a Bengali American writer named Jhumpa Lahiri, who made her name with first stories that came out in Plowshares and then in the New Yorker, and eventually became the book The Interpreter of Maladies. I think it came out in 1999. It was, or she basically came out of the box as a complete and mature writer. The book ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize in 2000. Then she wrote a novel called The Namesake. I think it came out in 2003, which was turned into a film. Then she came out with another book of stories. I think it was called The Unaccustomed Earth. And then she came out with her fourth book in English, another novel called The Lowlands. I think that was in 2013. One day I'm in the library on a visit home to the States, and I see her most recent book, and it's called In Other Words. And I start flipping through it, and it turns out that she decided at basically the midpoint in her career, because she's a young writer, she's exactly the same age as I am, 54, she was born in 1967. She decides to just move to Italy, stop reading and writing in English, and start doing it only in Italian. Obviously, this was a story that I could relate to. The book, as I say, In Other Words, which was published by Knopf in 2016, was or had been published a year before that by the Italian press Guanda under the title In Altre Parole. She wrote the book in Italian herself with help, and it had been translated by Ann Goldstein. So she decided not to translate it herself because she wanted to avoid the temptation to improve it. I think the line is she didn't want to smooth out the rough edges. there was a tremendous amount in this book that I could relate to. Firstly, I guess, she describes her first contact with Italian in 1994 when she was in Florence. And I think the way she describes it is, it's like a person met one day by chance with whom I felt an immediate connection, of whom I felt fond. She says, I would feel unsatisfied, incomplete, if I didn't learn it. She first talks about Italian as though it were an infatuation of hers, an obsession, a devotion. And then the metaphor changes to her being the mother of two children, Italian and English, and she feels a preference for the runt, the weaker child, which is Italian. There's a sense in the book of contention between languages that exist within us. With her, that contention is more complicated because Jhumpa Lahiri's first language was Bengali. She describes Bengali as her mother tongue and English as her stepmother tongue when she was 6 or 7 years old. From that point on, she says she was reared by English. And there was contention between those two languages too in her life. She says it was as though they didn't want to know anything about the other. And almost in rebellion towards both her mother tongue and her stepmother tongue, she ultimately chooses Italian, and it creates this kind of triangle which she talks about. She also talks about, at one point, the process of learning another language, especially at our age when she began to learn it. She talks about a basket that she goes into the woods with and begins collecting words from all around her. But when she gets out of the woods, scarcely anything remains because the basket is memory, and memory doesn't hold up. At one point she says that reading or translating is the most intimate form of reading. We need to put so much more of us into the activity of reading when we're reading in a foreign language, because, as she says, you feel kind of disoriented all the time. You don't get tonal differences. You don't understand the connotative richness of words and of expressions as you do in English. She mentions Beckett, who was Irish, choosing to write in French because he wanted to write without style. In her opinion, she has more style in Italian. The kind of awkwardness, the eccentricness of her Italian. She has a large vocabulary, but it's an eccentric one because she's pulled it from all sources and she doesn't really have a context to put it into, which reminded me of something that Ernest Hemingway once said about style, that style was our awkwardness. It's interesting to see a writer with the descriptive powers in English that Jhumpa Lahiri has to suddenly switch to another language. Not only is it gutsy, it's just, at one point she says it's a demolition and a new beginning. And that's true, because I think she says writing in another language is like writing with her left hand. She says, when I give up English, I give up my authority. And at one point she quotes the great Mexican novelist Carlos Fuentes, when he says an awareness of impossibility is central to the artistic impulse. An interesting idea, because Jhumpa Lahiri talks about this new relationship with imperfection, how it stimulates her. So would I recommend this book? To me, it was extremely relatable. Does it have universal appeal? I think so. You know, after I read Interpreter of Maladies and I read The Namesake, what was so amazing about Interpreter of Maladies was the seamlessness of her prose. There was never a dead line, ever. There were never passages that you thought, well, maybe this could go. She had you enthralled sentence for sentence, from beginning to end. She raised the bar so high with her first book. I remember picking up The Namesake, and I would say until about 3/4 of the way through the book, it was the same. And then it seemed to me like there were passages that didn't have the same juice. They didn't pack the same punch. They didn't enthrall to the same extent. And it was unfair of me as a reader to kind of rule her out at that point. I felt as though perhaps she was writing too much, that a talent like hers should perhaps be cultivated and preserved and not milked too much. I felt like The Namesake did not bode well for her future books. And so here she is, right? Just the respect I have for a writer like this, who just basically risks it all to try to reinvent herself. I mean, not like in a new genre. She reinvents herself with a new language, basically relearning to write. And this is the first book she wrote after relearning to write. I mean, yeah, you got to pick this one up.